My name is Jay Castaneda. I'm in the psychology department, and I'm in room Anderson Hall 015. And I've been asked to talk for a bit about positive thinking and the powers of optimism and why that's a good thing, especially in college years. And so in starting off, I just want you to sort of think for a moment about certain types of jobs, and the one that I have sort of particularly to talk about is like telemarketing. And to try to think about being a telemarketer, and some of you might have actually had a job in these kind of areas, but to think about having to do that job and sort of what that would entail. So if you're a telemarketer, you probably would have to call people up at times, what they called cold calling, which is basically that you know the people don't want you necessarily to talk to them, but you have to call several hundred possibly during a day. And to think about having to make those calls and that stack of numbers, and most people that are not wanting to talk to you are probably going to reject you, maybe in obscene ways or rude ways, but that overall you're probably going to be able to get like 3 or 4% of the time that you call somebody that they're actually going to make a sale. And to try to think about why a job like that is discouraging to people, why it's a hard job to be able to do, and why people don't necessarily enjoy it. And then in sort of trying to think of that, I'm going to try to relate that a bit to the college experience, unfortunately, but in dealing with this idea of optimism. So the idea is to start with this concept of what do we mean by optimism. So when looking at optimism, we look at 3 main factors. And usually when I ask a class what they think optimism is, they most often answer with just looking at the bright side of things, which is part of what it is. But what we're going to be talking about is the idea of basically permanence, personalization, and pervasiveness, and that those 3 factors tend to be important with regards to optimism. And so what's meant by that is for personalization, for example, let's say I go home to my wife and she's had a really bad day and she's a little snappy, and so she snaps at me a bit. If I sort of tell myself that we're going to get a divorce, or that she obviously doesn't love me or like me much because of that, then that would be an example of taking that very personally. And this could happen both for bad things that happen, but also for good things that would happen. The idea of permanence would be that if I, like for example, when my first semester of college, I didn't do very well. My GPA was kind of low. And I remember thinking to myself that I'm not going to be able to do much if I'm going to be only getting this kind of GPA, and therefore, but what I wasn't paying attention to was of how much things were going to change over the next 4 years being in college. And so I wouldn't necessarily well, first of all, my classes would be different. I would be able to choose stuff that I actually like to do, maybe. But also, more importantly, I would change a lot. My study habits would change, and my success, maybe even just in general, my scholastic ability would increase a bunch. And so that was an example of taking my grades permanently of that first semester. And then the pervasive one is a little more difficult to explain. The pervasiveness is sort of like if you could see your life as like a pie chart. And the question is, how much of this event has taken up of that pie chart? For example, let's say I did really bad on a psychology test. And so I got like a 52 or something on a psychology test. That I could think that I'm going to do bad in this class. That's one aspect of pervasiveness. But I could also think that not only will I do bad in this class, but also I'm just a bad test taker maybe, and I'll do bad in all my classes. My chemistry classes will go poorly. That's a little bit broader. And then something even more pervasive would be something like, well, who's going to want to date a guy that can't even get a 65 on his test or something? So I've actually made my grade somehow relevant to my dateability and maybe even marryability or something. So that would be a very pervasive way of taking that. And so as we'll talk about, what Seligman, a person that we'll talk about in a bit, what their definition of optimism is basically that when good things happen to you, you take them as personal, permanent, and pervasive. But then when bad things happen to you, you take them as not pervasive, not personal, and not permanent. And that's how when he discusses optimism, that's what he's talking about. And we'll get back to that a little bit later as well. So let's talk about Seligman for a moment. So Seligman is an important person in the research area for optimism. He's a very important person as far as positive psychology goes. And so his initial research was with the animals. So he mainly did work with animals. But he was eventually contacted by a huge insurance company. And their argument to him, they were trying to basically find out if the work that he's been doing with animals can somehow relate to their job as an insurance company. And so basically the issue that they brought up to him was that we're basically hiring all these people to come in. We pay for their training. And then within a year, about half of them quit. And we want to know if you can tell us anything to be able to make it a little more predictable about who's going to quit so we don't hire those people, because that's a huge amount of money we're wasting on them when they leave. And so what Seligman decided to do is he gave basically an optimism test to all the incoming people toward going to that insurance company for that year. And then first of all, the people that go into that job also have to take basically a skill test, kind of like an ACT or SAT, but it was for insurance sales. And so he took people that just barely failed that test, so they would not have been hired otherwise. So they were a low skill group, but they were also optimistic. So he had this high optimism group. And then he just sort of let it go for a year and see what happens. And no one knew who the group was except for Seligman. And at the end of the year, he found that the optimistic group sold more, did better, got better manager approval, they were liked by their coworkers better, and more importantly, they stayed. They stayed at the job, and that was really the main question that he was asked to address. And then, so he then took this same research strategy and looked also at boot camp, because that was also an area where people would drop out fairly quickly, and then also at Penn State, at college, and basically found that that was really good for predicting who would stick with the class material and not drop out of college. So this brings us sort of to the part of the talk where I describe why this is important to you, why this is an issue for college. That one of the big issues of what optimism brings is it brings a certain level of resiliency. And the key thing to understand, and unfortunately this can't be said in a really nice way, is that college, for the most part, will make you fail at some level. Part of the job of college is to make people struggle. And I don't mean fail as in you're going to fail a class or even necessarily a test. But the idea is that many times during college, you should have to approach a problem with your usual level of motivation and energy and skill and not be able to succeed with that. And you'll have to back up, reassess, and reapply yourself. And optimism is really good at being able to do that. The more optimistic a person is, the more likely they're able to reassert themselves. And what Seligman found was that the real important part is how they handle failure, not how they handle success. It's nice to handle success in a permanent, pervasive, and personal way. But the more important thing is when you fail, you're supposed to handle that without permanence, pervasiveness, and personalization. And so that's why that's really important for schoolwork. And the more that you're able to apply that, the better you'll be able to retain, sort of stay in school and other types of things. And the important point is, if let's say somehow your skill level is so high that you're not challenged in college, the point is you will eventually have to face that whether it's a marriage issue or a job issue or a parent issue, there'll be times in life when you will eventually fail. And the point of Seligman is basically, if you do so as an optimist, you will continue to be resilient and continue trying, whereas a pessimist will quickly disengage. And that's the part that's the big problem. So the basic conclusion of this would be, so great, so now I'm a pessimist, so how would I do now? I don't know, you haven't told me anything except that I'm cursed. And so the important thing to understand that Seligman offers is how to change from a pessimist to an optimist, not globally, but just in areas such as academics or relationships where it would help the most. And it's really not that difficult to do. All you have to do is, when you feel that you have not succeeded in something and you can tell that you're being fairly hard on yourself, all you need to do is ask yourself, in what ways am I interpreting this as permanent, personal, and pervasive? And then how can I interpret, first of all, is that accurate? Is it really personal? Because some things are personal, some things are permanent, and some things are pervasive. But just ask the question, is this really those things? Is it really personal, pervasive, and permanent? And if not, then how can I look at it in a more constructive manner? And if you do that, then that gives you a really good chance of being able to make it through the sort of difficult times of college, as well as other difficulties that you might have. That's really all I had for today. I'm glad that you guys gave me the ability to be able to talk to you for a little while. If you have any questions or comments, or just want to stop by and ask any questions, feel free to stop by. Again, my name is Jay Castaneda, and my office number is 15 in Anderson Hall. So thank you so much for your time, and hope you have a good day.